Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Shirley Hoogstra. It's often noted that the Sunday morning worship time is the most segregated time of the week. And yet people reject that, they want it to be different, and they want the strategies to be multi-ethnic as churches. They also want to be more inclusive as Christians. Our guest today is going to help us understand what works and what doesn't. Join us on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is Gerardo Marti of the Davidson College Sociology Department, an ordained pastor and author of 2 scholarly books about churches in Los Angeles, including A Mosaic of Believers, Diversity and Innovation in a Multi-Ethnic Church. Welcome, Gerardo.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great to have you here.
It's my pleasure.
This is a very important topic, something that the church and society is very interested in. As you know, there's that quote, that church is one of the most segregated hours of the year, the day, the week, and yet Mosaic is not a segregated church in Los Angeles. Describe Mosaic.
Mosaic in Los Angeles is one of the most innovative and one of the most diverse churches in America today. And not a lot of people necessarily know about it, but to come to terms with what happened there and why it happened there in a little church established by Southern Baptists in East Los Angeles, that it would become one of the largest and most interesting multi-ethnic churches in America. I think that was a story that needed to be told.
Yes, and you're a sociologist, and yet you study churches. How did that come to be?
Well, churches end up being really strategic sites for understanding how social change is happening. Now, people don't necessarily like change, but churches change. Sometimes the issue is not whether your church should change, it's whether you want it to change intentionally or accidentally. And Mosaic is just an interesting case of a church that intentionally embraces change and said, we're going to move in a direction because we believe that this is the direction that we need to be moving in, and that was able to cultivate a culture that moved its people with it.
Well, now that's the big question, cultivating the culture. So tell me how important it is to have a charismatic leader like Erwin McManus.
Well, that is a great question. Erwin McManus is a very compelling speaker, and he's an excellent leader and a friend. And it's been really interesting to watch his ministry grow. But not everyone thinks that having such a strong leader is a good thing. And I'm not sure that you can automatically say that we would prefer churches that don't have strong leadership. So I'm not sure if that's really what we mean to say. And I don't think that any good leader believes that any strong church is built only on their own leadership.
So there has to be a combination of congregational innovation and buy-in. But it seems to me that if you don't have a leader who is casting a clear vision and probably smoothing things over when there are the conflict moments.
Well, what I can say about Erwin McManus and other leaders that I've seen like Erwin McManus is that they focus on inspiring their people. And so rather than bullying people into a direction, it's really attempting to paint a portrait of a beautiful future, and a future that we can all attain together as an extension, not as an addition, but as an extension of our core Christian commitment.
So now you have a community together. And how did you get a multi-ethnic community together with a shared vision?
Well, part of what's interesting about Mosaic is that it has a history. It feels like a very new church. People come in and they go, church in a nightclub? Look at all these young people. What's going on here? Non-traditional spaces. It doesn't feel like a church, and so they think that it must be only 5 or 10 years old. But the church actually was founded in 1934. And so this congregation, in its history, has had a strong commitment to being able to reach out to people that's different from themselves. In East Los Angeles, there was a leader that came before Erwin who was very aggressive at trying to integrate with the Latin American population that was becoming more a part of that region. And at that time, the white Latino connection was very rare. So I think that those cross-cultural barriers were overcome early on. But I think that the more fundamental shift was when they decided to move from a little building that only had 40 parking spaces, and in a place in Los Angeles that a lot of people are frankly very afraid to drive to.
Okay.
When they moved a mile east to a larger facility at East Los Angeles College, and that opened up a main thoroughfare closer to freeway access and closer to a growing Asian population, one that's grown phenomenally from the 1990s to today.
So place matters.
Absolutely, and we have to acknowledge that. You can only work with the diversity that the demography sort of allows you to have. But it is the intent of the church to embrace that change rather than to reject it. And so the move from Brady Street was a traumatic move for many people, even though it was only a mile. But that move initiated a set of new practices and new openness that I think opened the possibility of embracing a kind of diversity that came.
But now, as a church moves like that, you're going to have some people who take that as an opportunity to leave.
That's right. But you have to understand that people take the opportunity to leave at any particular moment, right? So I think that whenever anybody says, we have 500 people in our church, you have to know that that's not the same 500 people. In any particular week, there are new people that come and there are people that leave. So the trick to growth is not how many people you attract. It is in part how many people you keep. And over time, then you can grow. And so I can trace in a period of Mosaic's history when there were 800 attenders. But those 800 attenders were churning. There were people leaving who were dissatisfied. There were new people coming because they were deeply attracted. And then over time, those new people built a foundation for what became really a very nimble church that was able to expand its mission in, I think, very interesting ways.
I want to pick up this idea of a nimble church. And you were on staff as a pastor of this church for a while, correct?
Yes, that's right.
And then you left in order to write the book.
Well, I was still on staff while I was writing, which is something that I wrote about in the appendix of the book, what's called the religious insider-outsider problem.
Right.
But it all has to do with who can best understand a site, a situation. Is it the person who's on the inside, or is it the person who's objective and on the outside? And I think that that's something that I had to wrestle with. Still, I was on staff, and that gave me an access to being able to watch things in a very intimate way for a long period of time.
Would most people say that you should be on the outside in order to do this kind of work?
Again, it's a debate, and it depends on what it is. But I can tell you that because I was a member of my church did not automatically mean that I understood my church. And there's something that happens when you ask a focused question and seek to answer that question. And the moment that I started to go, okay, what makes and keeps Mosaic multi-ethnic? That was my first question. Then I started to impose on myself a new set of eyes. And I began to feel responsible not so much for the welfare of the congregation, which is what pastors do, but more for the kinds of issues and questions that a scholarly community and church pastors and leaders outside of the congregation would be interested in knowing.
Well, you get the question all the time, how did this happen? And we touched on being nimble before. I wonder if there's any correlation with the willingness to give up some of your past in order to embrace your future.
Well, that's a great question. One of the things that we all know about multi-ethnic, multiracial churches is that there's no formula for it. And all of us who are just beginning to study this phenomenon, really, we clock the beginning of study, of the formal study of these congregations to around 1998 or 1999. So really, we're less than 10 years into trying to really understand how do churches become racially and ethnically diverse. And I'm contributing to that, but I know every person who studies this because we're a growing community. And you, if you're a church leader and you are diversifying your church right now, if you go, my church is diverse and I'm proud of it, I want to tell you, you are a pioneer. You're a person who's accomplished something in your church that has not been accomplished in many places. Your congregation is a special place. And so rather than my coming to you and telling you what you need to do, as a scholar, I actually come to you asking questions about what happened.
And you talk about ethnic transcendency in those questions. You say, how is it that you could take a group of people that were proud of their ethnic heritage, but they transcend it to a common mission? How did that happen?
That's another great question. And there is the sense that if we only honor ethnic specificity, whatever that may be, or however my race or ethnic heritage makes me who I am. If I base my interactions only on that, then I will only see a difference between me and you. So in a sense, we always have to overcome whatever those differences are and go from my people and your people to being who we are together.
Right. So now how much did the leadership casting that vision make a difference?
Well, I think that was a component of it. But another interesting thing was some artists that began coming, people who like to paint and draw. And they said, I'd like to get a group of people and do a Bible study with artists. And can we do some projects? And then we said, maybe we can incorporate art into the sanctuary and into the services. And so I remember the Sunday when I noticed that there was a blank canvas and that there was an artist painting before the service began. And they continued to paint throughout. And then soon after that, there were sculptors up. And then soon after that, there were blank canvases set up, and people in the congregation were invited to come on down and to paint. And so that idea of taking a community that had an interest and an affinity and allowing that to restructure the lines of affinity that can happen in a congregation, I think is part of the way it happens.
Right, so you talk about reorienting identity. So the identity is first as a Christian, a believer in Jesus Christ, then as an artist, and then perhaps as an artist who brings a certain ethnicity.
Right, and this is the way we talk about it theologically. But sociologically, we might be attracted because there are a lot of other artists here first. And then you go, wow, I didn't know that there were other artists here who actually had some kind of a faith commitment, or that they had a faith commitment in Christ, or that it related to the church that I grew up with. And then out of that affinity, then they begin to forge together a bond that says, we are connected in this way. And not only are we connected with each other as artists, but we're connected with other people in this congregation through this common bond of being dedicated followers of Jesus.
So you're using the artist, and we'll use this word now a minute, haven, that you have identified at Mosaic a number of havens, whether it be art or age or other interests. But those havens then are a way to be a mission centered, or it's an evangelistic tool, right? This idea of first being attracted as other artists and then sort of falling in love with Jesus Christ.
Right. Well, it's holding everything in tension. People believe churches are communities. That's absolutely true. But people also believe that churches are purposeful communities, and that's true too. And Mosaic, I think, holds that tension very nicely. The havens is a very interesting notion in that people don't always come because they're attracted to something. They're also escaping something else.
Right.
And I think that we talked about the artists. There are artists at Mosaic in part because those artists were not embraced. That aspect of themselves was not something that was welcomed or even recognized in other places that they had been. And so they sort of escape places that seem to reject a part of themselves and are attracted to places that does really embrace that.
So one of Mosaic's values is innovation.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because the idea that change is central rather than peripheral to the character of God. That God is actually moving towards change, embraces it. The process of discipleship is a process of change. And that part of what God is doing through history is watching things happen, change progressively towards a different kind of place.
Well, you started this discussion by saying that change is something that's very important, and now you're saying again that God is a God of innovation or change. Now, some might criticize that and say, well, this church is just about change for change's sake.
That's right, that's right. And I think that when you read carefully the book, you'll see that they root it deeply in a biblical theology that says this isn't just to try to chase after popular culture. It isn't just because we want to somehow have more bodies, but it's a conviction about what the nature of the Christian life is. And there's an embrace within that, not just of change, but of risk-taking, of sacrifice, of being willing to get out of your comfort zone, of being willing to reach out to the alien or the stranger, the foreigner. All of those things that I think we all acknowledge are uncomfortable and are unsettling, but actually point to different ways that stimulate innovation and change, both personally and corporately.
So the gospel is about risk-taking and welcoming the stranger and the other. And I think that your book would say a multi-ethnic church helps us as Christians do that best.
Well, I think that it's one way. I don't want to make it the best. And this might be a time to say that we all now hold the ideal of being racially and ethnically diverse. And even churches that have no diversity have that as an ideal. And now I'm starting to see websites and pamphlets that show color on paper that don't exist in the actual congregation. We've taken it as a value. That's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. And yet it's not realistic to expect that every church would become diverse.
I have to tell you a wonderful story about a congregation that so valued that. We were vacationing in South Carolina, and we had a little practice that we would look in the phone book on Sunday morning and pick out the best name of a church and attend there. And it was the Soul Saving Station. And we said, oh, let's go there. And it said we are a multi-ethnic church. So we thought, oh, how interesting. And this was probably 7-8 years ago. So when we walked in, it was an all African-American church with one white person, one Caucasian. And we inquired, why did you call yourself a multi-ethnic church? And they said, for so long as we have one other person, we value that. So now we know that there are lots of Caucasian churches that have a hard time diversifying, and you've written in your book that African American churches have a hard time diversifying. Why is that?
Well, I think it just comes down to we don't force people to go to a particular church in America.
Right.
You get to choose. And because you get to choose, what we find is that people most naturally choose places that are already a part of the networks that they have. And through a lot of different networks, structural phenomena, where we live, things that we've inherited in American history, we have very racially defined boundaries to our relationships. And I think that that's an unfortunate consequence of our history that we're still working through. So when a church says we want to be multi-ethnic, they're actually trying to counter all the forces that are separating us and attempting to bring us together in new and distinctive ways.
Has Mosaic had any success in bridging the African American congregant with the Mosaic congregation?
Well, of course, they've acknowledged the African Americans who are in their congregation, and that there's a lot going on there, as well as the Hispanics, the Asians, and the whites that are there as well, and even Middle Eastern, which was a surprisingly high number of people as well, if you break these things down. But there's another church that I've just finished writing about in a book called Hollywood Faith. It's a black-white congregation. The largest single group is African American, and they pursue their ministry a little differently. One, they do very much acknowledge that African Americans have a history of racial oppression, that things are not easy, and they make it a very forthright thing. And I found ministry application forms that said, you know, do you drink, do you smoke, those kinds of things, but it also said, are you racially prejudiced, or have you had difficulties in this area? In other words, the church makes it a value that we're not going to accept any form of discrimination that happens, and out of that it creates a place that people can be welcomed in. And the music is really great. It's a funk R&B rhythm, it's danceable, it's exciting, and they have been able to build effectively a black-white church, which is very, very difficult to do.
Now, music is such an important part of worship, and we've heard about the culture wars, you know, sort of high church music and other kind of church music. And how important is music in establishing a multi-ethnic church?
That's great. Well, you've opened up yet another debate, and this is what I'm writing about now, is to understand worship in racially and ethnically diverse churches. What I can say is that there is no single style of music that you'll find in all multi-ethnic or multiracial churches. That's good news and bad news, of course. The good news is that there's variety and diversity, and we can honor a lot of traditions that are inherent to different denominations or religious orientations. The bad news is that it's not easy. And I think that some people say, okay, we need to have more X, whatever that is. Let's say we need to have more Latinos. So to them that means let's sing a few more Spanish songs. And that's really a very naive understanding. If you say, well, we really want more African Americans, throwing in a Negro spiritual is not going to diversify your church. So we can't treat music as something that you can manipulate and think that somehow that's going to change the racial composition of your church. So I'm trying to think more about that.
So the common mistakes, one would be what you've just mentioned, is just try to a superficial way of adding a music component. What are some of the other common mistakes that churches who have a good intention make?
Well, I think that sometimes the idea of presence, I do understand having people who are diverse in terms of background, leadership, and whoever's reading scripture or upfront singing or whatever you have up front in more public, prominent places. Sometimes we can inadvertently look only for color, or even people who we think are culturally different, but they're just a different color, and so we ask them to come up. And that is a form of tokenism. When I've gone to churches that are successfully diverse, if they have color in public, it is a symptom that the church is already diverse. And so just putting up more diversity doesn't automatically mean you'll get more diversity. I think that's a common mistake.
What about actually preparing by understanding what the issues are?
Sure, I think that can happen in formal ways, and I know churches that have done that, but I think it happens most effectively in informal ways. There's a woman who really valued being in the choir. And I had a wonderful time talking with her, and she sang songs. But then I understood it wasn't just about the music. It was that her choir and the people that she hung around with, those were the people that they celebrated their birthdays together. They would help each other if they were sick. They attended each other's family functions. The choir rehearsal became a more important point of community than the choir performance on Sunday morning. And I think that those kinds of connections that churches can build between people is the place where people come to deep levels of understanding of each other.
You talk about multi-ethnicity as being more fluid than you first realized. What do you mean by that?
Well, ethnicity is often treated as highly static. This is who you are, this is what you're born with, and it never changes. And ethnicity is actually something that we can accentuate or we can obscure. At some points, it's important for me to tell you that I'm Cuban, but at other times, it's important for me to just say I'm Hispanic, and at other times, I'm just white. So it really depends on the circumstance what seems to matter. And Mosaic is an interesting case of a place that really reduces the specificity of a person's ethnic background, because it says that for our functioning together, that's not the most primary thing that we need to know about each other. Now, it's important and it's honored, but if we're going to relate to each other, it's a lot more important if we have a common sense of mission, if we have a common worship, if we have a common cause. That's more important than whether you're somehow from a different ethnic or racial background than myself.
So this is different than color blindness.
That's exactly right, and it is not an attempt to ignore. It's an attempt to acknowledge that our identities have a lot of texture. There are a lot of aspects about us. I mean, I only know certain things about you, but there are a lot of connections that I have with you that I may not know. And a congregation can be a part of unearthing points of connection and affinity that we may have that we didn't know about each other.
Sounds like there is a basic value of knowing each other.
Absolutely. There's this common sense of humanity and really honoring that the person in front of me is a very rich human being who's gifted and has a lot of different talents and passions that they bring to the table. And part of what I do in my encouragement to you is to allow those things to come out. Otherwise, if we only accentuate that we're different, we need to make sure we know that we're different, then we may actually create a wider gap than we need to.
So we're hearing each other's stories to find commonalities and similarities, shared interests.
Absolutely, and the church in its function, in its worship, attempts to draw those things out. So it's a process that I've called ethnic fluidity, which is that process of seeing how things can come to the prominence or recede. But ethnic transcendence then is that time when we say, you know what, it's really not just about ethnicity. We're connecting on a different level. And it's not that it doesn't matter who I am, it's that you and I, we see each other as brothers and sisters. And that brother and sister connection in Christ is our place of connection. It's our place where we hold hands and we're moving forward to face the world together.
So in this rich texture of ethnicity, how about race and class or education? How do class and education come together?
Again, great. Those are important issues, and Mosaic tries in many different ways to allow people to connect to each other at various levels. I was deeply impressed when, for example, around a table, here's a UCLA professor, PhD, fully tenured, you know, been there for a long time, and considering one of his best friends, people who have come out of poverty, a very isolated background, not cosmopolitan at all, but the sharedness was not education or class. The sharedness was a deep sincerity about who we are as we're growing in this faith together.
There's a myth that people like megachurches or large congregations because they can go in, go out, and not be known. What you're describing, though, is a congregation committed to spending time together. Does that really happen?
Absolutely, absolutely. I don't know of any church, however big or small it is, that intends for people to only remain anonymous. They want to provide open doors that allow people to come in, but everything about that church is structured to try to get people to get closer and closer and to find connections with people that they didn't have before.
So how does it actually look during a week at Mosaic? How do people draw into that conversation other than on Sunday?
Well, there are a number of different things. Of course, we know small groups are a part of what churches do today. We also know there are different ministry teams, whether they're working on things locally or overseas. We know that there are artistic initiatives that have happened. We know that there's dance and drama and other things, and video and lighting and filmmaking that's happening that's also supporting the ministries of the church. So there are a number of different ways that people are investing in the mission of the congregation, and those lines really go beyond whatever's happening on Sunday morning.
And that really forms community.
That's right, and it's not the only, Sunday morning is not the only entry point. The entry point comes at a number of different other areas. Let's say I'm working on a big installation. That's an artistic project to try to get people to catch the theme of that morning, because they'll recreate the foyer or recreate the opening point. And so I go, okay, I can't do this by myself. So what 10 friends do I have that can do this? And there are people who may not be at all connected to the congregation or may have no particular faith at all, but they're incorporated, they're welcomed into this particular project, and it becomes a part of community working together. And I think, again, that happens over and over again at multiple levels. That's what I think that Mosaic is particularly good at. Project orientation, a number of different things that people can join in on, short-term and long-term, that both highlight where the congregation is going, but also try to maximize relationships.
Thank you so much. My guest today has been Gerardo Marti of the Davidson College Sociology Department and author of Mosaic of Believers, Diversity and Innovation in a Multi-Ethnic Church. I'm Shirley Hoogstra, and thank you for watching Inner Compass.